What's up, APUSH? It's Mr. Hill coming to you from my living room. And I am now going to go over the entirety of Unit 1, which is actually quite short, guys. It's really just the first chapter of pageant. Although I will tell you, as I told you in the beginning of the year, that there are just a couple of things that pageant's a little bit lacking on from this unit that the College Board, can ask you about, can test you on. Um, I am going to go through this unit review. At the end of this unit review, there is a DBQ outline prompts, complete with 5 documents that I'm asking you and your partner to analyze and break down, and then go through and fill out the AP History modified DBQ outline sheet here. You guys can type these and submit them via the Dropbox on Schoology. This is due tomorrow, which would be Thursday, at 11 p.m. Okay, so as I always do when I go into these breakdowns, is I always like to start, first of all, by breaking down the time period and the key themes. So right off the bat, our time period is 1491 to 1607. The College Board is very deliberate with their dates, guys. And when you see 1491, you know that this is pre-Columbus. We know that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And because of this, we need to know what is going on in the Americas, what's going on in the United States before Europeans arrive. And so that's a big one, obviously. And then ending in 1607, we know that is the establishment of Jamestown. I understand that this material is not on the AP test. However, you may contextualize with this material. You may use outside evidence with this material. And this material is just important for us to know as Americans. And especially, guys, knowing that Jamestown comes into play in 1607, that could easily become relevant in a contextualization for whatever kind of essay they throw at you. Okay, so according to the College Board, the unit key concept is on a North American continent controlled by American Indians. Contacts among the peoples of Europe, the Americas, and West Africa created a new world. So it's all about contact between these 3 continents for the first time coming together and creating massive changes going on. But to know the changes that go on, there are some must-know terms from each unit. This is actually terms that the College Board gives us that could appear as actual that they may ask you a question about these specific terms. Maize agriculture, the Columbian Exchange, or the encomienda system. These are things that the College Board says that we as teachers must teach the students. And so, of course, this will come in this unit review. Okay. Every time that I go through a unit review, I also talk about the key themes for each unit. As we go through and we get into units 3 through 7, which were the units for the AP test this year, you should take very, very special attention and care in knowing these themes. Because obviously you guys aren't going to remember every single date in this course, but when you look at a time period, you should know what is going on thematically, what is happening in this exact time period. I do have a theme sheet study guide to give you guys when the time is right. But for the meantime, right now, guys, let's just understand what the themes are for this unit. So first of all, number 1, we have pre-Columbian societies. They're adapting their lifestyles to live in their diverse environments. It's all about what environment are these Native American societies living in. That's going to dictate how they live their lives. Where there is maize agriculture, there are sedentary societies. There are people living in one place in larger villages. Where there is no maize, there is more nomadic societies, hunter-gatherer societies, kinship groups, those sort of things. Then 2, Columbian Exchange. That's a huge one. It's actually a huge one in all of the AP history classes. How are the people affected? How are the peoples affected on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean by the exchange of crops and disease. And then number three, Spanish colonization, especially the encomienda system, the three Gs, right, coming from Spanish colonization. Why are we only discussing Spanish colonization right now? Well, because the period ends in 1607. The unit ends in 1607. That is the establishment of Jamestown. Then we'll get into successful English colonization. Okay, so these key concepts that you'll see many times throughout the unit reviews, guys, are coming straight from the College Board um, key standards, the standards. When I go through and teach this stuff over the course of the year, I don't go over the key concepts. However, I think it's helpful for you guys now that we're studying for the AP test to understand this is, in the College Board words, exactly what we need to know, key concepts that we need to know. We need examples of these key concepts. So before the arrival of Europeans, native populations in North America developed a wide variety of social, political, and economic structures based in part on interactions with the environment and each other. Okay, this is our, pre-Columbian Native American societies. They're going to give us a couple of locations, and we need to know at least one sample tribe from each of these locations and how they lived. So we start, of course, by talking about how do we have Native Americans in the first place. Well, we have migrants coming over from Asia at an ice age in which people could cross over the Bering Sea across the Bering Strait and into the Americas. But what's kind of interesting about this, passage that took place, tens of thousands of years ago, is that while people started coming into North America, modern day Alaska, and then through Canada, they mostly ended up in Central and South America. Our biggest civilizations emerged in Central and South America, although they came into North America first. Now, why was that? Why is that true? Why did that happen that way? The answer is because of topography, because of climate, and of course, because of agriculture. We had about 50 million people living in the Americas when Europeans arrived, but the biggest majority of them were in Central America and South America. Okay, so the two greatest empires that existed when Europeans first arrived, you've heard of them many times. Of course, that's the Aztec and the Inca. What were the keys to their rule? I put it right there first. The College Board's going to beat into your head: agriculture. That's a big reason why both of these civilizations relied heavily on agriculture. Of course, they're sedentary societies. They're staying in one place. And both of them are going to utilize maize agriculture as their primary crop, although the Incas also used potatoes very effectively. Both of these places had large populations. The Aztecs had perhaps the biggest city in the world at this time, Tenochtitlan, which was what they call the floating city in Lake Texcoco, where we had about 200,000 people living there. Which, as I mentioned, were probably the biggest city in the world, especially advanced because the overall place where they're living, the island isn't all that big, and they would literally build land onto their island by taking mud and rocks from the bottom of Lake Texcoco and building it onto the land itself. They also were masters of agriculture in the respect that they would actually farm on little floating gardens in Lake Texcoco themselves. They would called the chinampas. They would build up land so that it was floating outside of the lake, and then they would cultivate corn and beans and squash there. Of course, corn being maize, Indian maize. And then the Incas, perhaps the biggest empire in the world at this stage, based out of Cusco in Peru. They would start in Peru and it would go all the way down South America, all the way down to the southern tip of Argentina. And they had this large road that connected their entire empire together, the Carpanon. These were very advanced civilizations, and yet we didn't see anything like this when we got into the modern day United States, north of central Mexico. We didn't see anything like this. And the question is, why didn't we see anything like this? In fact, we only saw a population of about 1 to 10 million people in the modern day United States. And they're much smaller. They're less sophisticated. We're usually seeing semi-permanent settlements of about 300 people in what we would call kinship groups. They're their families and extended families and relatives that would move from one place to another. They're hunter-gatherer in the respect that largely the men would go out and hunt while the women would stay home and gather. Because of this arrangement, women actually held a tremendous amount of power in these Native American societies, having matriarchal societies or many times matrilineal societies. But the big thing that the College Board wants us to know with this is, why are we so less sophisticated, smaller societies up here in North America? The answer, of course, is because of maize agriculture, how slowly it spread from Central and South America up into North America. When it did make its way into North America, it transformed societies. Societies went from small nomadic villages into larger permanent societies that way. Maize agriculture is so important, guys, that it feeds about 20 million people in Mexico alone. That's how important the Indian corn maize was. You may be asking, Mr. Hill, what about the Mississippian culture? There was a large society culture that existed and at least started around modern day Mississippi. Well, the answer to that one would be that the Mississippian culture disappeared around 1300 because of a prolonged drought. So, we don't actually learn about Mississippian culture in APUSH because they weren't around when the Europeans arrived. Okay, so there's 3 areas, guys, that we need to specifically know what a sample tribe from each of these areas, and then how they lived and how they adapted to their environment. So when we go to the Southwest region, you can see on this map here, the Southwest region is, coming in and closest to Mexico. It's coming from Central America, and therefore they're going to first have access to maize agriculture. Because of this, we are going to see a sedentary society. We're going to see people staying in one place. A sample group there would be the Pueblo. The Pueblo lived in permanent buildings. They lived in caves, under cliffs. They had irrigation farming. This is very common with maize agriculture. You would see maize also planted with beans and squash. This is our 3 sisters farming that existed together, because the maize would grow up in a stalk, obviously being corn, and then the beans would grow up along the maize and would add some nutrients, and then the squash would grow at the base and kill weeds from coming in and disrupting the crops. So staying in one place, the Pueblo living in the Southwest region. The Great Plains, however, was not very suitable to agriculture, and agriculture arrived there later than other places. And we know this, even tying it back to 400 years later, when we get into the end of the 19th century, the 1800s, where we have the homesteaders that are coming into the Great Plains area, and you realize that there's not enough rainfall to sustain agriculture there. And so because of this, we didn't have people farming, we had people hunting, mainly nomadic hunting tribes like the Sioux that would hunt the buffalo, and they would use the buffalo for all aspects of Native American life, for decorations, for tools, for knives, for clothing, all of these things. And then when the horses arrived in the Columbian Exchange, and they traded or stole horses from the Spanish, this transforms the Sioux's life. Now they're mounted hunters following the buffalo, which makes things a lot easier to follow the buffalo herds. And then as we get further east, we start to see once again kind of these mixed societies. When maize agriculture arrives, this is going to allow them to stay in one place, but also because you have access to the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean, we also see sedentary societies because we have a stable supply of fish for fishing. We have the Northeast Mississippi River Valley and the Atlantic Seaboard tribes. They have a stable food supply, and so they're both hunter-gatherers and farmers. They are going to develop these permanent villages there. And I guess by far the most famous of the tribes would be the Iroquois Confederation, where really actually it's just that. It's a confederation, not one tribe, but 5 tribes coming together. They had these long, 200-foot long longhouses, they call them. They were a matriarchal society. The women in their society got to determine whether they go to war or not, which is very important. And speaking of war, they actually had lots of wars, the Iroquois did, even before the Europeans arrived. because in forming this large confederation, they came into combat with several local tribes. One such tribe, for instance, being the Huron tribe that originally lived in the northeastern portion of what is now the United States. They came into heavy conflict with the Iroquois Confederation, and the Huron were actually pushed out of the current United States and up into Canada. And the reason I bring this up is because when the French and Samuel de Champlain started to come in and colonize Canada, they befriended the Huron tribe. And by befriending the Huron tribe, we saw that this made a very, very big enemy out of the Iroquois Confederation. The French made an enemy of the Iroquois Confederation, and then we saw, of course, that in the French and Indian War, that the Iroquois, many of the tribes of the Iroquois, 3 of the 5, fought on the side of the British because of this alliance between the French and the Hurons. Okay, so that's our talk of Native American societies, and now we go into 2 of the other major concepts, guys, which is the Columbian Exchange, and then just in general, how contacts among American Indians, Africans, and Europeans challenged the world views of each group. This is going to be cultural stuff. This is going to be religion, especially, that is drastically changing life, especially in the Americas, but also in Europe as well. So we start, of course, with the Portuguese when we talk about European exploration, because the Portuguese were first. The Portuguese had the first monarch that sponsored exploration. We saw King Henry the Navigator is going to pay for Portuguese explorers to go out and try to find a route to the coveted Asia and the items in Asia, especially India, which had the spices, and had contact with Chinese merchants. And so they had porcelain and silk and sugar and all of these wonderful things that Europeans wanted. And so our Portuguese are going to be the first to try and make their way around Africa over to Asia and to India. And we saw the first explorer being Bartholomew Diaz, and he's first around the Cape of Good Hope, but he turns and he goes back. And then we see Vasco da Gama, the long trip coming down from Portugal, stopping along the way in Western Africa and establishing trade posts there, which become slave trade posts for the Portuguese, and then finally making his way around the Cape of Good Hope over to India, where he establishes very profitable colonies over there and trading with India. Now, the Spanish, in seeing that the Portuguese have become so successful in Indian Ocean trade, now realize that they need to establish very profitable trade to the west. We can't go east because the Portuguese are already there. We can't go through the Mediterranean because the Ottoman Empire still controls the Med. And so because of this, they turn to the west. And of course, very famously, this brings onto the stage Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, the very Catholic monarchs that are looking again for the 3 G's: gold, God, and glory. They want converts, they want glory, and they want gold. And so they are going to fund Christopher Columbus, an Italian man, a Genoa man, to sail west, looking for a pathway to Asia. And while he does not find a pathway to Asia, what he does find are several islands in the Caribbean, which he names Hispaniola. And this, of course, starts European colonization in the New World. Our Spanish conquistadors then are going to flock to the Americas looking for those 3 Gs, the most famous being Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro, who we'll talk about in just a second. But before we do that, we still have this rivalry between Spain and Portugal, 2 very Catholic countries, and they immediately find that their claims throughout really not just the New World, but also Africa and Asia, are starting to overlap. They're starting to have some tensions over whose land is what. And because of this, they look to the Pope. And they say, Pope, can you please help us settle our disputes over land? And in 1493, just a year after Columbus, the Pope is going to draw a vertical line on the world map called the line of demarcation. And you can see the map over here. This line here was the first line that was drawn by the Pope. All lands to the west are given to Spain, all the lands to the east are given to Portugal. Now, at the time, the Pope thought, this makes sense because now we're giving all of these West African colonies to Portugal and all of the colonies established in India to Portugal as well. But of course, the Portuguese thought this was drastically unfair, and because of this, the Spanish and the Portuguese agreed to move the line over several degrees to where it currently sat there in 1494, which gave the Portuguese claims to Brazil. Then they signed a treaty called the Treaty of Tordesillas, and they decided to split these territories evenly this way. Of course, we aren't talking about the British right now. We aren't talking about the French right now. This is all, guys, before 1607. It's really all about Spanish colonization in the New World. And when the New World and Old World come together, we see the Columbian Exchange. And guys, the Columbian Exchange is heavily, heavily tested. Obviously, with the change in the AP test, this is probably something that won't be asked upon, but it is still obviously a very important concept that, who knows, it may be relevant, but it's just important for us to know. So what is going on here? We see an exchange between really all of the continents in the world. One common misconception is that it's just Europe and the Americas where we have exchange, and that's really not true. We really have exchange, especially between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And there's a lot of crops and disease being exchanged, but the most important ones really, I'll start from the Americas, the New World to the Old World. We have highly caloric and very profitable crops that are being exchanged. Now, the Americas, what made them so amazing, especially the complex societies like the Aztec and the Inca, is that they're able to support these massive populations without some very important innovations. They didn't have any draft animals. They didn't have horses or oxen, which means they couldn't pull plows by animal. They had to do it themselves. Also, they didn't have any pigs or chickens, things that produced domesticated animals, that produced food for them on regular bases. They needed highly caloric agriculture to be able to feed this massive population, and that's what the Americas had in plenty. They had maize, obviously. They had potatoes and tomatoes. These are going to come in and transform the European diet. These highly caloric agriculture is going to bring about a large population increase in the Old World. We're going to see Old World population increase. That is the biggest impact of the Columbian Exchange. We also see things like tobacco, which obviously isn't going to bring about a population increase, but it becomes a very important cash crop coming over from the Americas into Europe. We also see, of course, the biggest effects in the New World, in the Americas, is disease. Disease is going to ravage the Americas, especially smallpox. Smallpox being the biggest killer in the Americas, but also yellow fever coming over from Europe and Africa. Unfortunately, in some places, killing 90% of the entire population of the American Indians there. So a tremendous loss of life from the Columbian Exchange in the New World. There were some positives from the Columbian Exchange for the New World, especially the animals, cattle, horses, pigs. The biggest one, guys, being horses. Horses, the most important animal to come over to the American Indians, transforming American Indian life, especially like the Sioux we talked about, hunting on the Great Plains. Okay, and then we get into European colonization in the Americas. What are the reasons for this happening? A big one is overpopulation in Europe, especially between 1550 and 1600, where we see the Columbian Exchange, new crops really starting to take effect. We see lots of births. More calories means we can support more population. We have all of these new people in Europe, and unfortunately, there's not available land or jobs for these people, especially because of the existing governments and laws that are still prevailing from feudal times, the primogeniture laws. And primogeniture, as you guys I'm sure remember, means that everything, all titles, all land, all wealth, goes only to the eldest son, that we don't have any land or titles or wealth going to the second sons and the third sons, and of course, any of the daughters. And so the problem with that is that, as families get bigger, we see so much more inequality for everybody except for the first son. And so we see very famous second sons into this time in history trying to go out and earn their wealth in a different way. For instance, Sir Francis Drake becomes a pirate, or Sir Walter Raleigh goes out and forms the Roanoke colony. And so this is a push factor. This is getting people out of their sedentary lifestyles in the ancient feudal societies of Europe. Obviously, in these societies, we see lots of peasants and serfs that don't own their own land. And now the Americas presents this huge, available land and opportunity that people then are going to use to justify coming over to the New World. And then the invention of the joint stock company, which is a huge invention and big push factor in getting people to come to the New World, because this now allows investors to pool their capital together in order to try and turn a quick profit. And we see the London Company, which forms Jamestown in 1607, obviously is a joint stock company. We also see the British do this very successfully over in India with the British East India Company, another joint stock company, in which very successful and brought lots of wealth. And so with this, we see all of these push factors towards the Americas, but there's also a very important push factor that is not economic, and that, of course, is religion. And religion is very, very prevalent, of course, in the 1500s and 1600s, and will be a major push factor for many of our first English settlers coming to the New World. Martin Luther very famously challenges the church with his 95 Theses in 1517, and this starts the Reformation. And really, in fact, the Reformation had been coming a long time before that, with people like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus and Aldrich Zwingli, and we now have all of these Protestant religions that are coming in and attacking the power of the Catholic Church. And with this, we see the creation of all of these new Protestant religions. And very famously, and most importantly, for the English colonies that emerge in what is now the United States, we see John Calvin with Calvinism, and then we see King Henry VIII with Anglicanism, or the Church of England. John Calvin, of course, has this idea of predestination, of the elect. And he is going to preach a very serious and very strict form of Christianity that is going to, touch our Puritans that are going to arrive over in the New England colonies. And our New England colonies becomes heavily, heavily based off of Calvinism. And then our Chesapeake colonies and our Southern colonies are going to be the Church of England, Anglican. And so, of course, this Reformation becomes very important in the colonization of what becomes the United States. But of course, before 1607, we don't need to talk about the Reformation in colonization yet, because that will be, starting in 1607 with Jamestown. And so beforehand, we talk about the Spanish. Any colonization before 1607, we talk about the Spanish, starting with the Aztec and the Inca, with Cortez and Pizarro coming in and plundering the wealth away from these two Native American societies and bringing back tremendous amounts of gold to the Spanish monarchy. Also in colonizing the former Aztec and Inca empires, setting up the encomienda system there, setting up these really profitable silver mines, one in Mexico, Zacatecas it was called, and then one in Peru, Potosi. The encomienda system is one of those terms that the College Board needs us to know. And this was our first labor system introduced in the Americas, introduced, of course, by the Spanish. Encomenderos were landowners. Encomendero means to commend, to give. And the thought process here is this was an exchange. This was an exchange between the Europeans, the Spaniards, and the Native Americans, and that the Native Americans would work on this land that was previously theirs, but now owned by the Spanish, and that they would farm, or they would come in and mine the silver mines, and then in return, they would get a good Christian education from our Europeans. Now, what this really was, of course, was thinly veiled slavery in the name of converting souls for Christianity. And of course, unfortunately, for both sides, especially the Native Americans, is that the encomienda system, while somewhat profitable, was not nearly as profitable as the Spanish would have hoped, because unfortunately our natives had no immunity to Spanish disease, and they died heavily with extended contact with the Spanish. As high as 90%, as we've mentioned, died from things like smallpox. And because of this, the Spanish became the first pioneers of bringing slaves over from West Africa. The Spanish and the Portuguese both began to bring over slaves into the Caribbean, especially, and down into Brazil. And this starts our slave system that emerges in the Americas and becomes the triangle trade, especially when we get into the 17th century. We always, we need to compare the colonization of the Spanish, the English, and the French. And this is, really going to span throughout the first two units. We've talked about the Spanish arriving first. And really, guys, we often forget about the Spanish because we focus so much on the English colonization and the French colonization. But in reality, the Spanish were amazing colonizers. They were empire builders. They were there to stay. And, even as we get into Santa Fe being the first permanent territory in the modern day United States over on the West Coast, which was established in 1610, they were controlling massive amounts of land in the Americas. The western part of the United States now controlled by the Spanish. The southern portion of the United States, all the way over to Texas, right, being controlled by the Spanish, and then all of Central America, most of South America being controlled by the Spanish. So the Spanish immensely successful in their colonization, and they in 1598 they're moving north out of Mexico and into Central America, into the Rio Grande Valley. So coming into North America, into modern day Mexico, they come into modern day New Mexico in 1609, looking for those three G's. They don't find furs or gold, but they do find converts. And so the Western United States becomes a place in which the Spanish are devoted to converting people to Christianity. Of course, we have Father Junipero Serra that starts to form the mission system over in California, 20 or more missions. And then we see over in the general western portion of the United States, we see a massive rebellion. The Pueblo are going to rebel against the Spanish. This is called the Pope's Rebellion. They're going to kill priests. They're going to kill hundreds of Spanish settlers. They try to eradicate Christianity out of this area. They resent the Spanish cultural destruction of their religions and ways of life. And it actually takes the Spanish 50 years to come back and reclaim this land for themselves. So our Spanish colonization in the Americas is obviously very important. What about the French and the English? Just a little preview of our next unit of study. So the French are very late to the game. Both the French and the English are very late to the game in colonization. The French are so late to the game because they are distracted, because they have religious battles going on, brought on by the Reformation. France, up until that point, had been obviously a heavily Catholic country. And then with the Protestant Reformation, we saw the birth of Protestantism. French Protestants are called Huguenots. And so we have this internal religious battles going on in France between the Catholics and the Huguenots, until a very famous monarch in France called Henry of Navarre comes in and issues the Edict of Nantes. And he says religious toleration throughout France is now possible. And because of this, we see that the French start to take aim at the Americas and try to make up the time that they have lost to the Spanish and the Portuguese. And so they send over Samuel de Champlain in 1608, who founds Quebec, which becomes the first permanent settlement established by the French in the Americas. This becomes a very important trading network for the fur trade that emerges with the French. Of course, with the French, what we have to remember is that they have the best relations with Native Americans. They are there originally to profit from the tremendous fur trade that exists in modern day Canada. And so because of this, they need to establish relations with Native Americans to learn the Native American ways of trapping and hunting the beaver, and then trading for beaver pelts from Native Americans. And because of this, they start to form little semi-permanent forts moving through the Americas, searching for the beaver. I got a nice little map that I'll show you guys right here, where we see the French starting to move through the Americas pursuing the beaver. And they go further and further into the continent, eventually making all the way down to modern day Louisiana and New Orleans. That was Robert de La Salle, who claims the Mississippi Basin area and names it after Louis XIV. And speaking of Louis XIV, he takes power in 1643 and he rules for 72 years, guys. He is going to take a very vested interest in the American colonies, and he is not going to let them go easily. He is going to defend them, which of course is going to bring us into conflict with the English. And finally, the English. The English are quite behind, as were the French, in colonization, especially for the same reason, because of internal religious problems. Henry VIII, broke away from the Catholic Church in the 1530s. We had our own internal struggles. And in the beginning, the English were quite happy to just raid the Spanish. And that's where we saw the famous pirates, the sea dogs of the Caribbean, like Sir Francis Drake, raiding and seizing the gold and silver from the Spanish galleons. But then they made some attempts at colonization that were actually quite pitiful. Newfoundland in 1583 was a complete disaster. The colonists attempted to make their way over. They lost their lives at sea. And then in 1585, that was Sir Walter Raleigh. He establishes a settlement off the North Carolina coast in the island of Roanoke, which was established, but then mysteriously disappeared, perhaps to disease or Indian attack. We don't know, swallowed up by the wilderness. The first, of course, successful permanent attempt at colonization occurs in 1607, and that is Jamestown. And Jamestown is a key date because that's when we know that the English are permanently in North America. Okay, guys, so your DBQ outline assignment, here is a prompt. Evaluate the tremendous change that occurred in the Americas and Europe as a result of European colonization of the Americas between 1491 and 1607. You do have 5 documents: document 1, document 2, document 3, 4, and 5. When you do these, guys, you, of course, need to be able to access the PowerPoint, which is posted on Schoology for your guys' convenience. When you answer these questions, guys, again, just as a reminder, you do have a DBQ outline sheet, if I can pull that up for you guys. DBQ outline sheet, here it is, that you may type in, that you guys can type in. You are doing this with your partner. I only need 1 submission on Schoology per partnership. You fill this out, you turn this in, make sure that you put your names on it. Once again, just a reminder, you may type these. All right, guys. Hope you looked at that as mostly things that you already knew. Of course, this is a review session. See you guys soon. I am out.